I want to try something. Wherever you are right now, whether you're sitting, standing, walking, even if you're driving, without looking at any part of your body, tell yourself where your left hand is. Not where you think it is in a vague sense, like on the left side of my body. Precisely. Describe it. Is it open or closed? Is it resting palm up or palm down? Are any of the fingers touching each other? Do they feel warm? You know, don't you? You knew before I finished asking those questions. You didn't need to look. You didn't need to think particularly hard. You just knew. Now, which of your 5 senses told you that? It's a trick question because none of them did. Not sight, not hearing, not smell, not taste, nor touch. The sense that told you where your hand was is one you were never taught about, and it's not the only one that you missed out on. We were taught from Aristotle onwards that humans have 5 senses. The real number, depending on how you count, is somewhere between 9 and, believe it or not, 20. Some operate below conscious awareness. Some are only now being fully understood by neuroscience. Some thinkers have proposed that we have sensing capacities that go even beyond those, for culture, for aliveness, and for the emotional landscape of another person. Today, Cole and I are going to take the 5-sense model apart, put something more accurate in its place, and explore what it means for how we understand ourselves and the people around us.
Welcome back to My BrainWise Coach. I am Cole Bastian.
I'm Phil Dixon.
You heard it here first. We do not only have 5 senses, we actually have more than we were originally taught, and we're going to be exploring that conversation today. And if you're enjoying our podcast, or it's helping you to think about your brain differently, then we would ask that you give us a 5-star rating and review wherever it is that you get your podcasts. And also like, comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social platforms. You can find us at My BrainWise Coach. So Phil, let's start with the history, because the 5-sense model is not just a folk belief. It has serious philosophical origins.
It certainly does, and it goes back all the way to Aristotle, where he wrote in around 350 BC in his work, The Anima. Now, I'm sure you've read it. No, I haven't, but lots of people have. And that's where he introduced the concept of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. 5 senses, 5 corresponding organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. It was a beautifully tidy system. And for about 2,500 years, roughly speaking, it went unchallenged. And that's not because it's right. By the standards of modern neuroscience, it's significantly incomplete, but because it was useful, teachable, and corresponded to the obvious external-facing senses that people encounter in their daily lives.
When did the cracks start to appear?
It seems like about the 19th century is when the scientific evidence began accumulating that the 5-sense model was missing something fundamental. Charles Bell, the Scottish physiologist who also described the facial nerve that bears his name, and the disease is called Bell's palsy, proposed in the 1820s that there was a muscular sense, the brain's awareness of the position and movement of the body. And then Charles Sherrington, another Englishman, he was a neurophysiologist, and he won the Nobel Prize for his work on the nervous system in 1932. And he gave that muscular sense its proper name, proprioception. That comes from the Latin proprius, meaning one's own, and capiel, meaning to take or grasp, the sense of grasping one's own body. And once proprioception was established as a distinct sensory system with its own dedicated receptors, the question became obvious. What else are we missing?
And the answer, as you suggested in our opening, is actually quite a bit.
It is a lot. Modern neuroscience recognizes at least a dozen distinct sensory systems, and some researchers count more than 20, depending on how fine in graduation you want to separate the categories. But for today's conversation, I'd like to work through the most clearly established ones. the ones that every listener will recognize once they're named, even if they've never heard of them. Then we can move to the more extended and more contested sensing capacities that some thinkers have proposed. The journey from 5 to 12 is in the neuroscience. The journey from 12 to what Esther Perel is pointing at is something more like philosophy of perception. Both are interesting and they are connected.
They'll take us through them, starting with the one in the opening that you just described.
You mean proprioception? It's the sense of your body's position and movement in space. There are specialized receptors called muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs distributed throughout your muscles, tendons, joints, and the connective tissue. They're reporting constantly to the brain. This muscle is stretched to this degree, this joint is at this angle, this limb is moving in this direction at this speed. The result is the continuous, automatic, below conscious map of where every part of your body is in space at every moment. Without proprioception, movement becomes extraordinarily difficult. There are documented cases of people who've lost that function through nerve damage. They can move their limbs, but only by watching them, and it has to be constant. Take away the visual check, and they can't walk, they can't pick up a glass. They cannot maintain a seated posture like you and I doing right now. We take proprioception completely for granted because it's never failed us. It is, in a very real sense, the foundation of every physical action we take. So how does it come about? So the next one is the balance and spatial orientation, right? And this comes from the vestibular system, which is housed in the inner ear. 3 semicircular canals and 2 other organs that detect the direction and speed of head movement and the position of the head relative to gravity. When you close your eyes and tilt your head, you know you've tilted it. When you spin and stop, the vestibular system takes a moment to recalibrate, which is why you feel dizzy. When the vestibular system and the visual system give the brain conflicting information, as happens in certain kinds of motion sickness, the brain doesn't know which to trust and produces the queasy result that most of us experienced at sea or in the back of a car. The vestibular system is continuously active, continuously updating the brain's model of your spatial orientation, and entirely invisible until it fails or disrupted. We had a dog once whose inner ear had an infection, and all of a sudden her head went to one side and stayed there. Now, no matter what we did, her head was on the side. And that was her vestibular system getting corrupted in some ways.
So what about the next, type of sense, which is thermoception?
Well, that's the correct name for it. It's our ability to sense temperature, separate from touch, with its own dedicated receptor cells. They're actually called TRPM8, if anyone wants to remember that. They are those receptors for cold, and TRPV1, which are receptors for heat. These aren't the same as the pressure receptors that give you the sense of touch. They respond to thermal change, not to mechanical contact. And they interact in fascinating ways with our senses, which is why holding a cold drink makes a room feel warmer, why menthol feels cool even at room temperature, and why capsaicin from chili peppers activates those heat receptors and produces a burning sensation even though the temperature of the food hasn't changed. The brain is interpreting a chemical signal as a thermal one. Thermoception also operates internally, monitoring core body temperature and feeding into the homeostatic systems that regulate that temperature.
And the next one on our list is nociception, which I want you to distinguish, Phil, from touch, because I suspect some people, think pain is just intense touch.
It's a common assumption, and you're correct in that it's incorrect. Nociception, from the Latin, if you want to, nocere, which means to harm, is the sensory system dedicated to detecting actual or potential tissue damage. It has its own specialized receptors, nociceptors, distributed throughout the skin, muscles, joints, and internal organs. These receptors respond to stimuli that are damaging or potentially damaging: extreme pressure, extreme temperature, chemical change, mechanical injury, those type of things. The signal they send is qualitatively different from the signal that ordinary touch receptors send. And the brain processes it differently, routing it through pathways that involve the emotional and alarm systems as well as the sensory cortex. Pain is not just intense sensation. It's a warning system with an emotional component built in, which is why the same injury hurts more when you're anxious or exhausted than when you are calm and rested. The emotional state modulates the pain signal because the two systems are neurologically connected. This has significant implications for how we treat pain, and it's why purely physical interventions often only address part of the problem.
Let's next talk about interoception, because I think we should spend a little longer on this particular topic, because I think it's one of the most consequential of the group that we're talking about today.
Yeah, it's a group of things. Interoception is the sense of our internal state of our body. It monitors and reports on everything happening inside you: your heart rate, your breathing rate, how hungry you are, how thirsty you are, your temperature, bladder fullness, the state of your digestive system, oxygen levels in the blood. The receptors are distributed throughout the body's internal organs, and the primary pathway to the brain is the vagus nerve, which carries a continuous stream of information from the gut, the heart, lungs, and other organs to the brain's processing centers. And the reason why this is the most consequential of the group is that it's the neurological foundation of emotional experience. When you feel anxious, what you're actually feeling is an interoceptive state, a particular pattern of heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, and gut activity. When you feel excited, the interoceptive pattern is remarkably similar. When you feel content, or depleted, or hungry, or even in love, these are all interoceptive states that the brain is interpreting and labeling as emotions. Emotion is not separate from the body. It's the brain's interpretation of the body's internal state.
As I'm hearing it, Phil, it really does have profound implications for what we know today as emotional intelligence.
They're profound. The neuroscientists Lisa Feldman Barrett have made this argument rigorously. Emotions are constructed by the brain from interoceptive signals, not delivered to the brain as fixed passages. The person with high interoceptive awareness, that's the person who has a fine-grained, accurate sense of what's happening inside their body, is a person with richer emotional information available to them. They can distinguish between anxiety and excitement, between genuine enthusiasm and what we call social performance, between the feeling that something is wrong and the feeling that something is simply new. Low interoceptive awareness correlates with difficulty identifying and naming emotions, and there's a long name for that, and with a range of mental health challenges. Training interoceptive awareness is, in effect, training emotional intelligence from the inside.
Which is a significant claim. And I think, Phil, it does directly connect to the personal threat profile, or PTP, that we've shared with our BrainWise friends on previous discussions.
It does indeed connect directly. The PTP is, at its neurological foundation, an interoceptive instrument. Never heard it called that before, have you? But that's what it is. When the protection driver is activated in a threat, there's an interoceptive state that corresponds to it, a pattern of physiological signals that the brain is interpreting as danger. The person who can detect that state early, name it accurately, and understand what's triggering it has access to self-regulation that the person with a lower awareness doesn't have. The capacity to notice that I'm in threat before my behavior is already expressing it is an interoceptive capacity. It's not a purely cognitive skill. It's a sensory one.
And you also mentioned, Phil, chronoception. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's the sense of time. And this one is genuinely mysterious. We've often said, we're learning things about the brain and we're just scratching the surface, so to speak. We know that the brain has a sense of time because we can estimate durations, feel the difference between a minute and an hour, and experience time as passing faster or slower, depending on our state. But the mechanism is not a single receptor system like the others. It appears to be distributed across multiple brain regions, particularly the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, both of which track interval timing, and the circadian clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, which tracks daily rhythms. By the way, don't try and remember all of that. Just remember that there's a sense of timing and it's spread across multiple regions. The experience of time speeding up when we're engaged and slowing down when we're bored or anxious is chronoception responding to the brain's arousal and attention state. And the distortion of time perception under extreme stress, the documented phenomenon of time seeming to go slow during accidents or emergencies, is a chronoceptive effect produced by heightened arousal flooding the brain with sensory information that it must process at a much higher resolution than normal. And I'm just going to give you another example. One of the things that happened to me many, many years ago is I got to learn to race go-karts. And the first time I spun a go-kart, I was amazed at how beautiful the landscape passed by very, very slowly. And yet the whole spin was probably less than a quarter of a second, but it felt like minutes.
And Phil, there's also, a question around magnetoreception.
I'm so glad you mentioned that one. It's actually the most speculative of all of these new things, and it's worth naming honestly as such. Magnetoreception is the ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field. And it's well established in birds, fish, and several other species as their navigation system. In humans, there's theoretical evidence and some experimental work suggesting the brain may have some sensitivity to geomagnetic fields. There are magnetite crystals found in human brain tissue, and some studies have found neural responses to magnetic field changes. But the evidence is early, it's in a preliminary state, and the mechanism, if it exists, is way below conscious awareness. I include it to make the point that the boundary of our sensing systems may be wider than we currently know, not to claim that humans have a working compass in their heads.
Yeah, I think some people would certainly disagree with us in that sense if we said that, because they probably get lost quite often.
Yeah.
So, Phil, there is something we have been slightly dancing around today. Touch, which appears in Aristotle's original 5, is not actually a single sense at all.
No, it's actually one of the most underappreciated facts in sensory neuroscience. Touch is a sort of generic label we apply to a collection of distinct sensory systems that all operate through the skin, but use different receptors, different nerve fibers, and different pathways. I'm going to name a few of them. There's Merkel cells and Meissner corpuscles that detect fine pressure and texture. Pacinian corpuscles that detect vibration and deep pressure. Ruffini endings that detect stretch and sustained pressure. Free nerve endings that detect pain, nociception, as we discussed earlier. Thermoreceptors that detect temperature. And a particularly interesting class of receptors called C-tactile afferents that respond specifically to slow, gentle, stroking touch at the speed of about 5 centimeters per second, which happens to be the speed at which humans instinctively stroke the skin of someone they care about.
So C-tactile afferents are specifically tuned to the speed of a caring touch, is what it sounds like.
Yeah. They send their signals directly to the insular cortex, and that's associated with emotional processing and interoception, rather than to the somatosensory cortex, which produces ordinary touch information. The gentle stroke of a parent on a child's arm, the touch of a hand on a shoulder in distress, these activate a sensory pathway that's neurologically dedicated to social and emotional touch rather than functional information gathering. The body has literally evolved a distinct sensory system for the touch that communicates care. And it operates independently from the system that tells you whether you've been hit or whether the surface is rough or smooth. Two completely different signals, two completely different brain destinations, both labeled touch.
So the body map, or what's referenced as the body map, I think might be relevant in this discussion.
Yeah, it's called the Homunculus. And it's like a little mini version. It's like mini-me inside your brain. The somatosensory cortex contains a topographic map of the body's surface. What Wilder Penfield, who mapped it in the 1930s, called the homunculus, otherwise known as the little man. Each region of the body's surface represented in a corresponding region of the cortex. But the representation is not proportional to the body part's size. It's proportional to the density of sensory receptors. The hands and the face, which are densely innervated and capable of extremely fine sensory discrimination, occupy enormous regions of that somatosensory cortex relative to their physical size. Our backs, which have relatively sparse receptor density, occupy a much smaller region. If you were to build a figure whose proportions match the cortical representation rather than your physical body, you would produce something pretty grotesque. Enormous hands, enormous lips and tongue, a vast face, and a tiny torso and legs. Reminds me of some people I know. The body we experience from the inside is not the body we see in the mirror. It's the body our nervous system has mapped, weighted by what it needs to attend to most carefully.
So Phil, let's go back to interoception for a little bit more and press on it a little further, because I think it is the sense with the most immediate practical consequence for how we live and work.
It's the sense that explains more about human behavior than any of the other. And it's the sense we pay the least attention to in how we raise children, how we educate people, and in fact, more to our situation, how we design organizations. The educational system teaches children to read, to count, to understand science and history. It doesn't teach us to read our own bodies. And reading your own body, having accurate, fine-grained interoceptive awareness, is the foundation of emotional regulation, of decision-making under uncertainty, of empathy, and of the capacity to sustain healthy relationships over time.
Share with us, Phil, the connection to decision-making, because that feels somewhat counterintuitive. Most people think of decision-making as more of a cognitive process.
And now we need to bring up a guy called Antonio Damasio. He developed a theory called Somatic marker hypothesis. We've touched upon it in other episodes. It's essentially an interoceptive account of decision-making. Damasio studied patients with damage to a part of the brain called the VAPC, who had lost their ability to integrate emotional and bodily signals into their reasoning. These patients could analyze options, articulate arguments, consider consequences. Their cognitive machinery was perfect, it was intact. But they couldn't make decisions. They would spend hours deliberating between trivial choices, unable to converge on a preference, because the interoceptive signal that normally says, this one feels right, was not reaching their reasoning system. The feeling is not separate from the decision. For most decisions, it's the primary mechanism by which the brain identifies the preferred option. Rational deliberation is the check on the interoceptive preference, not the other way around.
Which means, Phil, that someone who has low interoceptive awareness is not just emotionally less articulate, they are at a decision-making advantage to some degree.
That's absolutely right. And the practical implication for leaders is significant. A leader who cannot accurately read their own interoceptive state, who cannot distinguish between the physiological signal of genuine enthusiasm and the physiological signal of anxious compliance, between the feeling of a good decision and the feeling of a decision that they have committed to under social pressure, is a leader who's operating without full access to their own intelligence. The gut feeling is not opposed to rational analysis. It's one of the sensory inputs. And like all sensory inputs, it can be trained, refined, and made more accurate.
So, Phil, how do you train it?
Practices that build the habit of attending to internal states rather than ignoring them or overriding them. Body-based practices, yoga, certain forms of meditation, somatic therapy, even regular physical exercise combined with a deliberate attention to how the body feels during and after it. They all build interoceptive accuracy. There's also simply the practice of pausing before acting and asking, what's happening in my body right now? Not what do I think about this situation, but what is the experience that my body is telling me? The two questions are complementary. They're not the same. And most professional training focuses entirely on the first, while almost entirely ignoring the second.
Phil, we've talked a lot today about different senses and what they mean to each of us as individuals, how our body might be using it from a non-conscious perspective. So I think before we go into some of the more extended territory that we discussed, let's do that in our digest series that'll come out later this week. And we can go into some of that more theoretical conversation perhaps. And with that, how would you close out this particular conversation that we've talked about today? What would our BrainWise friends, like the top 2 or 3 things that they should remember or act upon based off of this particular discussion today?
Well, first of all, what you were taught was wrong. You were taught there was 5 senses. There's a lot more than that. We've identified a few of them. Whether you can remember the name of them or not doesn't matter. But just remember that your body is giving you all sorts of information, whether it's internal, external, from your fingers, from the position of your arms and limbs and things like that. All of that is information coming into your non-conscious brain. And the more you can pay attention, you can even train yourself to pay attention, the more likely you are to be able to integrate those interoceptive pieces of information with the cognitive pieces of information when you're making decisions.
I think it's great territory. It's great discussion today. It's really fascinating, to hear about and learn about all of the different senses. I actually found myself really enjoying listening to the different parts of today's discussion, and I'm sure our BrainWise friends did too. So as always, if you are enjoying this conversation or it's helping you to think about your brain a little differently, like, comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social platforms because you can find us everywhere at My BrainWise Coach. And also give us a 5-star rating and a review wherever it is that you get your podcast, because it certainly does help us grow our BrainWise community. And with that, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay BrainWise.